Can you just check the fonts? I think
Go ahead and open it. Is this your job?
Yeah, it's mine to load some fonts.
Yeah, we have first two already on here. We were just putting his on here. The only one is Fabian.
I think it's supposed to all the fonts.
Yeah.
Should be okay.
Is the screen setup okay now? Because it was screwy.
It was mirroring before, but
Yeah.
anyway. Sorry, let me just pull this first one up and then we'll look. What's the name?
Marina. So Mahesh is the.
We're supposed to.
There's Mahesh. Yeah, thank you. It's the. Sometimes we watch it from the far.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll do it. Just. No, you don't want to. Yeah.
All right, we're going to get started. I know it's running a little late. The session's called Supporting Infrastructures. The first presentation is by Mahesh Marina, and he's going to be talking about uncovering mobile infrastructures in developing countries with crowdsourced measurements.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So the work that I'm going to present today is joint work with my recently graduated student who has moved on, and it has fallen on me to present. So the topic of this paper may be on the minority side for this particular conference. It's slightly more technically oriented. My effort would be to try and have you see the relevance from an ICTD perspective, and hopefully that comes through by the end of it. So, doesn't seem to be working. Okay, that's fine. Thanks. Okay, so at a very broad level, the information that we are interested in extracting is, given a region, where are the locations of the cell towers, okay? So any kind of region, it could be at a city level or at a country level, we want to extract this information. So from an ICTD perspective, the representative use case for this kind of information is to be able to identify who has access and who doesn't, okay? And so the map shown here is in fact an actual case study done by Steve Sung about a year and a half ago for Liberia, using some cell tower information that he had access to, and also overlaying it alongside population data, so that you get a sense of, at a national scale, the areas which have mobile infrastructure and therefore have coverage, and the places which doesn't. And in fact, this map sort of shows that there are highly populated areas in parts of Liberia which do not have any mobile infrastructure deployed. Okay. So one could go further beyond just adding population information. You can bring in information like income levels, and also zoom in at an urban level, urban area granularity, and ask questions such as how deprivation links with the level of mobile infrastructure in terms of the density of infrastructure. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a relevance aspect for this work from ICTD perspective. And there are a number of additional use cases going beyond that, some ICTD related, some beyond that. So I would not labor on all of these. So hopefully you get a sense that there is some value for cell tower location information. And the question is, the main issue is this information is not publicly available. And there are good reasons for that from mobile operators' perspectives. So a particular case that's worth highlighting here is the UK Ofcom database that used to exist about 10 years ago. And this was a result of a member of the public using the Freedom of Information Act to request this information to be made available. And over several years, there were legal hurdles to make this information public. Eventually, the European Court of Justice asked Ofcom to publish this data, but by that time, the operators stopped contributing to this database. And as a result, by the time it was published around 2012, this database was already quite out of date. And now this whole project, SiteFinder project, has been abandoned. So there's one example of a case where there are obstacles to publicly distributing this information. So can we do something to infer about how the mobile infrastructure is at a national level, at any regional level, through measurements? And a natural way to do this is to rely on users' devices through a crowdsourced way or otherwise. We sort of assume the crowdsourced approach here, but one could have war walking, war driving kind of approaches as well. And through this, we can use the signal information from a user device and try and reverse engineer the transmitter locations. Okay, so that's the broad approach that this paper takes. What do we do in this paper? So in terms of the key highlights, we looked at the existing work on measurement-based cell tower localization and examined how effective they are in terms of the accuracy they provide. And based on the limitations of these approaches, we proposed a machine learning-based way to improve on the accuracy. And then we present a few case studies showing its value of this localization technique for inferring mobile infrastructure footprint in developing countries. Okay, so the methodology is relying on publicly available crowdsourced measurement data sets, and this is a key part of this work. And for this, we primarily relied on OpenCellID database, various subsets of that database. Some of these at the top have ground truth information, which is quite useful in evaluating the goodness of various localization techniques. And we've also got other subsets which are used for showing the value. So in addition to these, there are other data sets that we've used, but I will leave that out in the interest of time. Okay, in terms of the literature on cell tower localization, there's been a number of algorithms that are proposed over the years. And this list shown here is a representative list from simplistic methods at the top to the ones that represent the current state of the art at the very bottom. So the filtered weighted centroid is the state of the art with respect to this particular problem. Now, these methods form the benchmarks for us to see how well we can do in practice. So one thing I should mention is that filtered weighted centroid is not a separate algorithm by itself. It's sort of a variation of a weighted centroid mechanism, which relies on filtering out noisy measurements in order to get better accuracy. Okay? So first, focusing on the 5 basic algorithms from the literature, we've looked at their relative effectiveness by seeing what percentage of the cases each of them gives the most accurate result or the lowest error. And it turns out that there is no single winner across all the various scenarios, across different data sets. And filtered weighted centroid is not better either. And this is because, the mechanism works well in certain scenarios where weighted centroid works well, and it does significantly improve on the error. But in scenarios where weighted centroid it gives high errors, the filtered version doesn't do better. Okay, so the mechanisms, simple-minded mechanisms like strongest received signal strength tend to do significantly better. So that's one obvious limitation of this particular mechanism. So overall, the summary is that the existing approaches, there's no obvious technique to go by when you want to do cell tower localization. So what we've done is we've turned this around and came up with an approach which does the following. So we have this suite of algorithms. Now the question is, which one should be used based on a particular scenario that you're presented with. Scenario here refers to a particular cell with a set of measurements that you have, and they have certain characteristics in terms of the distribution of measurements, the signal strength of these measurements, and so forth. So what we do, our general approach in addressing this problem is, so given this cell and the various measurement characteristics, so we want to be able to pick the right localization algorithm that is most likely to give us the most accurate result. Okay, so fairly straightforward. Now, a naive instantiation of this approach would be just to go with that pie chart that I showed you a couple of slides ago, and then just use the various percentages of scenarios different algorithms work best, and use them as the probabilities of selecting them, and then do the localization. And it turns out that this a very naive approach already does better than the filtered weighted centroid approach. However, it completely ignores any specifics of a particular given cell, and so therefore it is far off from the oracle or the best thing that we could do, as well as even the strongest received signal strength approach. So I don't think they're particularly visible. So our idea is slight sophistication of this, but still fairly standard basic machine learning, where we try to have different features extracted from the measurement data, and use that to characterize the specifics of a particular cell, and then view the problem as a classification problem, where different classes refer to different algorithms, and we want to be able to pick the best algorithm given a set of features. Okay, and we have some measurement data with the ground truth to be able to train these classifiers, and then the trained model is then used to make inferences for further cells. So I've done the usual, asked the usual questions of what measurement features need to be there, which are important, and how much training you need to be able to do, and what are the different classification techniques. I will not go into the details of this, but all of this is discussed in the paper in detail. So what I will just highlight is this approach, although simple-minded as it may seem, it does fairly well. So the headline result is that it does give localization results which are within 20% of the oracle, but compared to the state of the art, it already gives about 65% improvement in median error. Okay, so with this mechanism in hand, now the natural question is, if we take it to the wild, where we may not have ground truth data, how would it work? And that was our original motivation in terms of being able to apply this in settings to be able to infer where we do not have any ground truth information. So as a step in that direction, we take the data sets for which we have ground truth and looked at the generalizability of these models, And it turns out that they do as well as, almost as well as the case where we already have trained the model using the same data set. And that is what is shown here, where we're off by a few, marginally off compared to a seemingly ideal scenario. And so we then focused on certain case studies, looking at different countries in Africa for which we had access to crowdsourced measurements, and seen the results of this AAS mechanism in terms of cell tower locations, and compared it with other public domain information that is available to see how well this sort of correlates. And although this is not very visible, so it turns out for Zambia, South Africa, and Morocco, for which we looked at the case studies, the results through visual inspection tend to match quite well. So the same can be said about Morocco here as well. So with that, let me just summarize. The main takeaways are highlighted in blue here. So essentially, the mobile infrastructure information is quite useful from the ICTD perspective, and we've redefined the state of the art in terms of being able to do more accurate cell tower localization through measurements, and highlighted its use for inferring infrastructure in developing countries. Thank you. I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Any questions?
Thing where I think the Red Cross in a recent practice, they just sent a whole bunch of volunteers throughout the country with their cell phones and said, you know, measure the cell signal and report. And there were a lot of issues that came up with the with doing that, technical, especially with the cell phones failing randomly, as well as, you know, we've also conducted some studies similarly, and we had some nasty technical issues as well. And one of the things we ran up against in our study was we couldn't figure out where the cell towers were just by looking for them. So what was interesting, though, is that there's freely available software in the Android marketplace that allows you to try to find the location of cell towers. The problem with this, though, is that they only really function if you have a data connection, because the way they do it is they, you know, find you're connected to this cell tower, I'm going to ping the database that has all the cell IDs, and then I'm going to get the geotag directly, but the phone itself doesn't have a way to determine how this, has a way to determine where the cell tower is. It's still querying the database. So I guess one of the questions then is, how are you, this is kind of connected to our research as well, is how do we move from connecting now, inferring the location of cell towers, to now saying how do we connect this to the ground truth of how people are experiencing cellular connectivity themselves? Because it may very well be the case that some of these places that are considered underserved, simply because, you know, people aren't there. It may appear that people are there, but they're not there, or people aren't using their cell phones there. So it may be the case that it doesn't fit necessarily with the context of use. So how do we connect? How do you think we should be connecting this kind of, this sort of approach to looking at cellular coverage with the quality of service and the, you know, quality of use that people in underserved regions are getting from their cellular networks? Okay.
So in terms of being able to make any inferences about quality of service, we need to know more than the location of the cell tower. And for scenarios where people may not be using cell phones or smartphones to be able to contribute measurements, so there is indeed a challenge. So this is not a panacea, but this can be realized through war walking or war driving kind of approaches that you were alluding to. and collect a representative set of measurements and then do the inferences. But given that we have several of these crowdsourced applications in use, including in the developing world, so there is a rich source of data out there, so which allows us to uncover most of this infrastructure. Of course, in very remote areas, this is a problem. So this is a problem with crowdsourced approach in general.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So next up we have Ratan Suri. This topic is toolsmiths in offshore work, socio-technical system of quality testing in India.
Okay, can you hear? Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ratan Suri. The work that I'm presenting today was conducted in association with my colleagues from IIIT Hyderabad. So this is a joint collaborative work, and I'm presenting the paper on their behalf. So when we talk about automation and how automation is having an impact on different types of industries, manufacturing industry, software industry, the debate is hinged on two competing perspectives, right? Perspective one says that automation increases efficiency, it brings in price cuts, and it also reduces lot of dependency on human beings, and so therefore it automatically translates into efficiency and greater productivity. The other perspective, which is its competing alternative, says that with automation there is going to be a tremendous amount of job losses, specifically jobs that are repetitive tasks and that which are rule based, because they can be easily automated. Therefore, in countries like India, the impact would be maximum, because we have a lot of these jobs that are outsourced, and it is bulk of the people in the middle class or mid-level sector of our service industry are employed in these kind of jobs. However, we argue as scholars, we put forth an argument that such competing perspectives often arise because most of these views are built based on bird's eye view of the industry. A lot of people, a lot of these articles that talk about the effects of automation often have a glancing, rhetoric. Like they look over the effects, look at some numbers, and try to make these projections. On reality, there is little effort to account for how daily work routines or work practices are reshaped when a particular technologies are introduced into a work context. So in this paper, what we do is we explore the consequences of automation in one particular field, that is in the software testing domain, and we analyze quality testers' responses to the idea of being called as toolsmiths through a counter discourse. What I meant by toolsmiths is they are assumed to be doing something like what a blacksmith does, repetitive tasks. So we want to counter this idea of how testing is not a repetitive task like a toolsmith. And using this counter discourse, we'd also like to dispel the assumption that QT testing is simply rule-based tasks, repetitive tasks that can be easily automated, and that what they do at the ground with the introduction of automation is much more complex, and they do a lot of work that adds value, but that remains not captured effectively, and it remains underappreciated. So in this paper, that's what we do, and then we take these ideas to provoke a discussion about how understanding the changing work environment can be extrapolated to prepare the next generation of quality testers, where their job profile, the way they could do their job, can actually bring value and not become simply another cycle of repetitive tasks, right? So the research method is, we conducted a field survey and study of current QT practices in India. I myself am a technical writer in my previous life, so I have worked with quality testers. So I am a bit, cognizant of all these practices. Then we also conducted 20 open-ended, in-depth interviews with different quality testers at different levels, including owners of quality testing outsourcing firms in India. Then we also analyzed a number of blogs written by experienced quality testers. Sorry, I'm fading in and out because I move away from the mic. And then we also traced daily routines of these testers. We also looked at the organization structures in which quality testers' work is embedded, and how they see the changing nature of their job, and how the changing nature has projections of how quality testing would be in near future. Then these transcribed data through the interviews was analyzed using grounded theory methodology, and I present these results. So I organize my ideas into themes, and sometimes my themes are not going very deep inside, but I can always open the forum for questions about specific things that I may not have completely covered. So the theme one is, generally we assume that everyone who actually takes quality testing automatically are allowing quality testers to become toolsmiths. But what we found was the choice of test methodology has an impact on how quality testers can or cannot add value to the work chain, right? So for example, if a company or a project decides to adopt quality testing, their budget, the complexity of their project, and other parameters often result in the choice of whether they would go for a quality automation testing or manual testing. So automation is not automatic. It depends on certain parameters, and people have a choice, or people do make a choice based on whether they want to go with automation or with manual testing. For example, there is one method called waterfall method, which often involves a different way of incorporating testing in the development process. Generally, testing happens after the product is, or a version of the product is released, and that results in a situation where there is very little interaction between people who develop the software and the testers. Or QT testers often in this context actually execute predetermined test cases, and so there is little space for creativity. Their tests are already predetermined for them, and they run that tests. There, the quality of their work can be, a repetitive rule-based work. The more newer methods like agile testing often occur simultaneously with the project development, which results in the fact that there is cross work and cross-functional interaction occurs. People who are in the testing team often interact with the people who are developing it, and the testing occurs simultaneously, and there is more involvement in not only the product development but also in the testing, and vice versa. And once the testers are also involved in the project cycle, then there is more space for them to exercise their own tacit knowledge, and also their own experience can be drawn upon to be able to develop the product more effectively. And once they are taking part in this, there is a greater perceived value for the quality tester in the project life cycle. So the way we choose a particular method also has an impact on how we perceive and value manual testers or quality testers' value in the project life cycle chain. Theme 2. Traditionally, the way we have conceptualized testing in Indian offshore places is more emphasis is on documenting the test cases, right? So extensive documentation procedures are put in place which take away the time from these people to actually do anything other than just testing and documentation. And then at some point, documentation turns into a very rigid process, and the number of test cases that are run and the amount of documentation that is run is a yardstick to measure productivity. So people's emphasis automatically shifts more on documenting and running test cases that are already predetermined, so that they're playing a numbers game, because their productivity and growth, or their own personal professional growth, depends on this as a parameter of measuring their productivity. And so people, especially at the lower rung, the junior testers, often follow step-by-step case execution and documentation procedures. That becomes one of the most important things that they end up doing, and therefore the perception that they are low value chain is reinforced. And all these procedures lead to a situation where there's very little creative freedom that can be exercised by these people, and therefore they're reinforcing the fact that they add very little value to the project cycle. So to summarize, the kind of current scenario, the work context scenario, results in where the improvement of the product takes a backseat. Logging a greater number of test cases or documentation becomes more center and important, and the work perception hence created is testing can be equalized to simple execution of a predetermined set of steps and logging of results. So this notion can automatically poise that kind of work task for automation, and it creates a conducive environment for floating an argument that this kind of work can be easily automated, because there is no creative space for people to actually exercise anything other than repetitive tasks. So how we conceive the work environment also shapes our perception about whether something can be automated or not. So now what we did was, based on our analysis, we present a counter discourse where we try to counter these arguments with a little bit of evidence that we gathered on what actually really happens in a testing environment, and how certain tasks that these people do and how that adds value often remains undocumented or remains unappreciated or underappreciated. So some clients trust manual testing than automatic testing. In fact, there are a lot of people who actually prefer manual testing, because manual testing really brings out a lot of hidden bugs that automated testing does not bring about. However, it's also true that companies that want to release quick versions of their software or trying to find quick fixes often rely more on automated form of testing. And so the choice of testing also is affected by the client, the size of the project, and the goal that a particular product or a service company has for taking testing. And there's also costs built into automation, because creating time for automation of tests takes a lot of money and time. Scripting and maintenance, the need for specialized resources becomes very, very high when it comes to automated testing. And all these, of course, translate into high costs. So all these factors also shape the pace at which automation can occur, and the limit or extent the automation can occur, and also the scope or the volume of what can be automated. And of course, automation can never replace human intuitiveness and human ingenuity, or the tacit knowledge people have gathered through experience that often cannot be replaced by automation. So what we argue is that there is an opportunity for us to be able to utilize quality testers' knowledge by going beyond the black box concept of testing. What I meant by black box concept of testing is to move, so black box testing basically refers to the idea of superficial testing that most people do. They are only testing about the functionality of the software and not the deeper integrity of the internal structure, modules, and units. So this is only a limited extent that this testing occurs. And what we meant by going beyond the black box refers to coming up with a lot of creative test cases, drawing upon their experience and their own intuition to be able to go beyond testing the mere functionality of products. And black box testing also allows people to create modifications and to be able to draw upon their own inputs to be able to do more creative testing. And also, it gives an opportunity for testers to push the boundaries and come up with new findings that automation testing often fails to discover. Okay, I'm having some. Sorry. So I just go. I don't want to use that. I'll just use my hand. So in recent times, there's also been some trends that are changing. So when we spoke to senior testers, they often, revealed that they, in recent times, they are getting more and more involved in the business process of testing itself. Now they are not isolated from the team that actually develops the software, but they are drawn more and more into client-facing work, including business strategizing, and how testing or testers and their knowledge is being drawn upon to involve them in higher order, cognitive activities that are related to project development. And they're often being involved to interface with business clients, and they're also very much involved in business context of the clients, and therefore testers are able to develop keen perception about business dynamics and the relationship to product testing, right? And testers are slowly beginning to focus on their clients' goals, such as customer retention, lower costs for acquiring customers, and improving sales, and how that is tied to the dynamics of testing and the outcome of testing, right? So if your credit card fails twice, then you probably never go back to that online merchant. So a tester can understand that and do enough testing to be able to create a product that is strong and rigorous. So that's an example of how they are involved in the business planning and outsourcing. And then automation has also opened up another door that is often neglected. 30 seconds. Okay, so automation resulted in speeding of test processes and saving time, but there have not been effective strategies to be able to actually integrate and use the time effectively so that testers can actually add value in the time that have been, they have been saving. So what are the implications of our study, right? I'm just speeding up a bit. So testers' voices actually are now pointing to hybrid testing environments. They say that if you create hybrid testing environments combining manual and automated testing, they can be potential to add greater value, right? And IT organizations can restructure their work strategies that can foster hybrid work environments. Testers can benefit if current training strategies can focus not only on testing, but also helping them to be better involved in the business processes or the development processes that are part of any project life cycle, and that allows them to add more value to the IT value chain. Okay, so
thank you. You have time for one question.
So, yeah. If there are any questions, there are some. These are all very they're a very bird eye view of the whole project. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask me.
Great. Thank you for your presentation. So the next talk is by Neha Kumar. The title is called Nurture Assisted Pediatrics for Indian Parents. And I believe she breaks the record for not having a PowerPoint, so all eyes on her.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? No? Is this better? Should I just use this? You use it. So it's a little bit hard to give a talk about an app, which would have really helped to have visuals to kind of help you show you the features and such, but I didn't really have an option today, so hopefully you will stay with me. I'm going to tell you about Nurture, which is an app that we designed, so ideated, designed, deployed, and evaluated it, and it was an app for assisted pediatrics for Indian parents. And this is a project that Rajesh Chandwani, who's the general chair, and was our first collaboration, and in some ways it's actually responsible for us even coming together to do ICTD here. So I will start with describing what the purpose of the app was and what was the need that we were trying to address with this. And there are two main things that we discussed in the paper. First is how this app, Nurture, was able to assist, engage, and empower Indian parents in monitoring the growth, development, and immunization of their babies between the ages of 0 and 2. And the second contribution that we try to make in this paper is basically through the design process, because this was kind of a different process of design in that it was born in a hackathon where we came together and spent 72 hours with a bunch of different stakeholders. So there was a lot of kind of really fast-paced, iterative prototyping going on. And then over the course of the next year and a half is when we did the rest of the research. So it's almost sort of an autoethnographic perspective on how this app came about. So to give you some background first, in India, approximately 22 million children are affected by developmental delays that often go undetected or are detected late, at extensive cost to parents and irreversible damage to their child. In addition, 30% children do not adhere to immunization schedules for various reasons. 40% are malnourished, and an estimated 7% suffer from obesity. So these growth and developmental issues, along with incomplete immunization, are also among the most prevalent preventable issues that contribute to child morbidity and mortality. Early detection of growth and developmental delays is critical for early intervention and for minimizing physical and financial costs. And so that was really our motivation, also added to the fact that due to acute time constraints, pediatricians are frequently unable to perform complete assessments of children's development, growth and development milestones. And so we were really kind of focusing on how we could inform parents such that they are able to play an active role in monitoring the growth, development, and immunization milestones of their children. So Nurture is an mHealth application that we designed to enable parents to do these things. And we were looking at the Android mobile platform mainly because it is the most ubiquitous smartphone platform that we could have targeted. And I'll talk a little bit about how that automatically limits our audience. And in addition to that, as I said, I'll talk about the design process, but also end with a question that I hope that you guys will help me try to answer with regards to the scope of HCI for development and what kinds of populations we can try to address the needs of. So the bodies of work that I'm connecting with here are basically HCI and children's health, also work on parenting that looks at recording babies first, so some of the work by Sarita Schoenbeck, Tawfiq Maris from University of Michigan, also a lot of the work done at University of Washington by Julie Keynes, who's also a co-author on this paper, looking at monitoring child development and growth. And then there's obviously, as many of you know, there's a lot of work in mHealth and HCI4D looking at various aspects of maternal and child health. And finally, there's literature on hacker spaces that we engage with. So there's been a lot of critiques of hacker spaces in terms of what they're able to offer in terms of supporting innovation and such. And while we kind of stand by that, because that was also our experience in going through the process of this design, we also found that there were some positives that came out of just being able to access so much expertise within the space of the hackathon. Now, in terms of the methodology, it was really tons of data. So you can read in depth in the paper if you want, but the process took a long time, as I said, over a year. And it started with a hackathon. And we came together, had no real desire to look at this particular problem, but we were coming from a space of having worked in maternal and newborn health. And so that was really our space of interest. And so 4 of us kind of came together, formed a team, and tried to think about this problem from different angles. So we had people from the business entrepreneurial end, and we had people from the medtech, and there was Rajesh, who's been a practicing pediatrician for many years and has focused on child development, and then I was the HCI representative in that group. And that kind of brought us to discussing how we could try to address this problem of lack of awareness on the parents' part of what milestones to really look out for, and also try to see how we could make it engaging. So almost looking at it from a ludic design perspective. So how could we draw parents to this app in a way that they would be engaged and almost entertained in using it, but really the point of it would be to kind of feed them information and notifications that would help them keep track of their children's progress. So from, and we came up with an idea, we presented it, we got first prize, which was awesome, but that also meant that we got some money, which then gave us the chance to kind of develop this further. And so from that hack to the prototype took us about 6 months. And in this period, we did a lot of data collection. So we surveyed Indian parents, we surveyed US parents, we tried to understand how pediatrics visits happened. We interviewed pediatricians to try to understand kind of what their perspectives were. And so that was the process through which we kind of prototyped and designed this. And our goal was really to kind of look at it as a probe to see how parents would respond to an app such as this. So from the prototype stage, we went to the testing stage, and again, we looked at, we evaluated it with the help of experts, some of who are in this room, as well as people outside and with different stakes in the matter. So in terms of the needs assessment, I'll go over this quickly, but really what we found, and it'll probably come as no surprise, so parents do use phones, smartphones, to record memories, right, so babies first, and so that was kind of what gave us the idea of thinking of the front end as being a baby book, where they would be kind of entering information or photos and such that they could share with family and friends, but also it would keep track of kind of where they were at in terms of the baby's progress from 0 to 2 years. And based on that, what milestones did they need to kind of check off? And if they weren't checking off those milestones yet, then they would probably need to go speak to their pediatrician. So in terms of the app itself, I'll focus now on talking about kind of the ways in which we found that the parents were empowered in using this app. So according to one parent, early feedback was, this seems like a good initiative. As a parent, I may not be overly concerned about delays in certain developments in my child, but yes, I would sure like to preserve moments of my child's growth. So there were, different perspectives on that in terms of like capturing their children's progress, and some were much more keen on just getting like scientific information, and others were keen on kind of tracking their children's memories more than the scientific information. And then there were people kind of along that continuum. So what Nurture really kind of offered was the baby book on the front, and then 3 other screens. So one was for measuring growth, and so really kind of charting out the growth and where the baby should be and where the baby was at the time. Then development, so looking at milestones that needed to be checked off. And even the process of translating these milestones was quite laborious. So what we did was we went through the milestones that are used in India by pediatricians to kind of see if children have met certain milestones. And we had to really adjust the language a great deal to try to make it much more user-friendly for parents to kind of understand what those milestones, what it meant for those milestones to be checked. The third screen was really kind of the calendar of immunizations. Okay, so I have 5 minutes. So really kind of the aspects of empowerment that I was mentioning were these. So parents do value in record keeping, right? They were happy to have a baby book which could capture photos and videos of their children. And then, as I mentioned, scientific monitoring. So this kind of gave them the sense that there was scientific information that was presented to them in a way that they could, act on it. And certainly there was value in greater awareness. So for instance, a parent shared, when I went to a pediatrician, he asked some questions. Does the child smile? Does he sit? But he doesn't explain all the things, why they are important and what is the sequence. We can't ask him, he is too busy, but we can come back home and look through this chart in leisure and can test these things. And that was really kind of the goal that we were getting at with this. There was also certainly value of more information. There were many things that the users, the parents who use this app for a month told us that they wanted. For instance, parents shared, first-time parents would like to know about sleeping patterns, feeding pattern, rashes, diaper rashes, etc. We can add lots of information about these things, even the experience shared by other parents about these problems. So there was lots of kind of feedback on what more this app could offer, because there was so much information that they felt that they were kind of lacking, and it would help to have a social support group with other parents. There was naturally the value of a good user experience, and they talked about where the information was kind of being provided to them, how it could be captured, how the notifications were coming too frequently, and so that could be adjusted. So there was feedback we got on that. There was value in reflection. So we had thought first-time parents would draw great value from using the tool since they lacked experience. But we also found that there were parents who were kind of second-time parents who felt that there were certain things that they had kind of noted with their first children, that in this case they were able to see great value in the app because it was a different experience. So that kind of and I'll end with this quote that a parent shared. My daughter has been diagnosed with autism. It is a mild one. She goes to a normal school. Initially, when I went to a pediatrician and said she's not talking, he checked her overall and said, does she walk? Does she smile? Does she understand? She could do all of those, but was not talking. Only after I kept on complaining repeatedly, he sent her for a detailed assessment when she was diagnosed. In my case, I know that these things are so important, the communication aspect, and I am more conscious about them. But while using this tool, I felt that it is good that all these aspects of development, like communication, are included. I know that if there is any problem in my second child, I will be more confident to ask questions to the pediatrician. Maybe an early detection might have helped my daughter. So these are the different ways in which we kind of saw that the parents felt that this could, it could assist them, it could engage them, and it could possibly empower them towards, taking a more active role. So there were the main takeaways that I would say here are really kind of the aspects of this empowerment, and there is a growing body of literature within HCI that's looking at patient empowerment, not so much parent empowerment yet, but that's also kind of a nascent and growing area, and so that's kind of one contribution that our paper makes. The second is looking at this hackathon, right? So obviously we don't expect great products to come out of like a 3-day period, but what was really helpful was sometimes these stakeholders can be really hard to get access to, and I'm sure that's something that you've all experienced. And in this hackathon we had access to public health professionals, to pediatricians, to physicians, to entrepreneurs, to a range of stakeholders. And so it was really helpful to kind of be able to get them in one room and talk to them and go through this iterative prototyping with them. Now, one question that kind of came up was initially we had thought of really targeting lower sort of socioeconomic segment of society. So looking at parents who don't really have access to healthcare as much. And then we found that even though there were parents who were middle class and therefore not so socioeconomically disadvantaged, they were still struggling with access to healthcare in a systematic, regular way. And what this kind of brought us to reflect on was that it's not necessary to look at the most marginalized parents or populations when we're looking at kind of developing these technologies. There can be other ways in which populations might be marginalized, and one might be in terms of access to stable infrastructure such as healthcare. And this is something that comes up in reviews as well, like why are these middle class parents, why aren't they more marginalized populations? And that's kind of the question that I have, and I'd love your thoughts on. What do you think, like when we're doing HCI40 or ICTD work, is it fair to be doing research with middle class populations who may also be kind of challenged in terms of these infrastructures? Or should we really kind of be focusing on populations that we can argue are the most marginalized? I mean, I'd love to hear your thoughts. So that kind of closes my presentation.
Thanks,
Thank
Neha.
you.
Any questions?
Hi, Neha. Ooh, it's all loud. So I have two kids, and in the first years of both, I used this app with my wife and our caregiver called Baby Connect. And I looked up the paper, so I saw some of the visuals, and it seems like that app has a superset of all the functionalities that you guys implemented. Memories, weight, even has a feed of nursings and poops. I could sit at work and get a feed of all the times the baby's diaper was changed. Not that I needed it, but it was really nice and reassuring. And I'm just curious, is there anything about your effort that makes it distinct from this existing app ecosystem that made it more, it says for Indian parents, and so, is it more situation specific or anything like that?
I mean, it's also, Rajesh, please feel free to share if you have thoughts on that. Would you like to answer that?
So when we talk about milestone measurements, some of the milestones are decontextualized, for example, sitting or standing. But many of the eye-hand coordination milestones are context specific, which are the type of toys which are used in one particular setup. For example, in India, might be different. The games which mother plays with the child might be different from what other context has. So what we did was we tried to incorporate those milestones scientifically arranged in a sequence where the common play which Indian mother does with the Indian children. So that's how the contextualization was important, because most of the mothers, they won't understand that it is measuring the milestones, but they would understand that this is the play which I need to do with my child, which she normally does. Thus, just that the app prompts her to do that, to undertake that play at 9 months.
There's something I would add to that also, actually, is that, so one of the parents who kind of used this app was telling me that all of the apps that we see in the market are American, like they're from the West. And there was certainly a sense that these apps are not for us, like they're not targeting us, they're targeting a different population. So that was one aspect. And then the other I would say is that I wouldn't say that the novelty of this research or the greater value is in the app itself, but I think it's the insights that we were able to get from the evaluation in terms of what it means to empower parents and what kinds of information is needed really for that purpose.
Thank you, Neha. I'm sure you can connect offline. We're running out of time. Thanks, Neha, for the presentation. So next up is Fabian Okeke. He's going to be talking about challenges and opportunities in connecting care recipients to the community health feedback loop.
It's okay, that's fine. That's okay, I'll just use the other stuff. Hello? Oh, perfect. Thank you for the opportunity to present this work. Can you hear me? Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to present this work. This work would not have been possible without two NGOs, Medic Mobile and Living Goods I have branches in Kenya, and also two amazing people, Isaac Holman, who is the research lead at Medic Mobile, and fantastic Nikki Dell, who is my awesome advisor, co-advisor at Cornell Tech. So imagine with me for a second that you're a parent and you have a child that's extremely sick. Let's say sick from malaria. And you live in a low resource community. Imagine something like a village where it's one clinic that serves many people. Of course, you want to take your kid to this hospital or clinic to help treat them. But you can't possibly walk to the clinic because it's too far. You could take the bus, but that means you have to pay, right? To and fro money, that's not something that you want to pay for. Again, remember you live in a low resource community. But even if you found your way to the hospital, one place serving multiple people, it means you go join the queue. So the top left corner, it's like a couple of people just lining up, if you imagine with me. What's one way you could circumvent this problem? There are multiple different approaches you can think of, but if you thought about community health worker, that's perfect. It's a model that we're very much familiar with. So a community health worker might come to your home, again, you're a poor person, and then check on your child, teach you some things about malaria to help you understand how you can better take care of your child. So we know very well that community health worker model has worked in different parts of the world, and they've been very awesome and amazing. But there are different ways that we could also improve these programs. What about improving them through some form of feedback? And now you may start thinking, why specifically feedback? Well, a lot of us are used to feedback in so many contexts. If you start thinking about simple things like Ola and Uber, or even transportation services like Lyft, of course, if you see a driver that has a 1-star rating, you're most likely not going to go with that person. Or if you wanted to purchase some item from Amazon India, and you see that 5,000 people have rated that item 1 star, you're most likely not going to go with that. So there's so many other services that show that we rely on reviews, ratings, feedback as some form of signals for us to make decisions in our daily lives. So we know the power of feedback to improve the quality of services, to help us move towards optimal choices where we want to make sure that we're getting more bang for our buck, and also to help us build trustworthy communities. So that's more feedback in non-ICTD context. It's been very well explored. When we start coming down to ICTD context, and specifically in community health worker programs, there have been lots of effort to build feedback tools for supervisors and donors where they get a bird's eye view of exactly what's going on in their programs. And recently there have been more work on community health worker tools that give feedback to the health workers themselves. So if I provide you some sort of feedback, personalized feedback on how you've been performing the last few weeks, you're more likely to go visit people or perform better. But there's still something missing in this whole feedback loop. What about feedback for care recipients or beneficiaries? The patients who receive these health services don't have some form of communicating feedback about the services that they receive. And arguably, these guys are the most important people in the healthcare feedback loop. I mean, without the patient or the care recipients, there's really no need to have a community health worker program. And so in this paper, we try to understand how might we include care recipients in the health feedback loop. So I'm interchanging between care recipients and beneficiaries and sometimes patients, but all three of them mean the same thing. And so to this end, we conducted a qualitative research in Kenya for about 3 weeks involving 23 participants, split into 3 different groups. So community health workers, beneficiaries, and some people that were supervisors. Again, in the context of 2 NGOs, Medic Mobile, that provides the technology and the mobile app that powers the program, and Living Goods, that's in charge of employing and managing supervisors as well as community health workers. And there are 3 major findings that I'm going to talk about in this presentation. So one is about the feedback that was collected, how they collect feedback, how feedback is used, and the challenges that are involved in this whole feedback process. And as I talk about this, I want you to keep in mind that the goal is to look for ways that you can connect care recipients to the feedback loop, but you can't just jump in and just build some technology and hope that it works. You need to go back to understand what's actually happening on ground, what are current practices, before you can decide exactly what kinds of tools that you're going to build for them. And so let's jump right into how feedback is collected. There are three primary ways that feedback is currently collected: through phone calls, through informal reports, and through chance encounters. The first approach is formal, while the other two are informal. So feedback through phone calls. How this happens is there are dedicated supervisors that call the care recipients in their homes. So imagine if you're a care recipient, you receive a phone call and it's asking you, hey, did someone come to visit you? And you say yes, and they ask you, how was that experience? But what we found out was this process of collecting feedback from care recipients wasn't necessarily focusing on the experiences of the care recipients. It was more for just validation to make sure that community health workers actually did the work that they were supposed to do. But you can imagine different kinds of problems that might come up when you try to collect feedback through phone calls. Now, the upside is if you call them, you can have rich conversations with people, but the downside is when you call some homes, you're calling someone who is extremely poor, what happens? They start out with, well, thank you for calling me, my child is sick, you know we're poor, we live in some community, we don't have toilet, and you're thinking, yes, I understand that, but what I really want to ask about is did you have someone that came to your household to come visit you? So bringing them back to topic is always something that's quite challenging. And there's also an important part of collecting feedback through phone calls. One major problem here is that it lacks equity. So in the context of the organization that we studied, because of the number of people in the community, they have to select the number of people that they actually call. So if you have thousands of phone numbers that you have, there's no way you can call all of them because again, you have only about 3 supervisors who are dedicated to calling. And so they pick about 30 people and then call these phones. But sometimes some people answer and other times they don't. So this lacks equity in terms of if someone does not have a phone, then they don't have the chance to provide feedback. Feedback was also collected through informal reports, and that's a case where a community health worker goes to the home of the beneficiary, talks to them, and could ask them about their experiences. Now, this is fine if, in general, the feedback that they're getting is more of a positive feedback. But if you imagine cases where the community health worker disrespects the beneficiary, there's no way for the beneficiary to say, oh, the feedback that I want to provide to you that you should send back to your supervisors is that you're a very disrespectful person, right? And so in this case, that lack of privacy and the ability to provide feedback in an anonymous way biases the forms of feedback that comes back through the community health workers. So if you're asking a community health worker, how was your visit? You say, oh my God, it was fantastic. Because of course, the supervisor asking them questions is using that format to understand how well the community health worker is performing. And then one other approach that was used in collecting feedback was through chance encounters. And this happens in communities where supervisors are wearing their shirts and walking around in the market, and people could wave at them and say, hey, I have something to say to you, and they could walk up to them and say, oh, I just want to tell you that your community health worker did something that was amazing, or this person was quite disrespectful in the way they treated me. But the problem with this approach is that it's not systematic, and there are challenges with the supervisor remembering the next time they meet with the community health worker. And now, still back on the findings, how is feedback used? So talked about how feedback is collected, and now I'm looking at how feedback is used. And there are 3 primary ways here. One is to motivate the community health worker and the supervisors, especially if it's positive feedback. If it's negative feedback, sometimes they use that in informing the kinds of trainings that go on with the community health worker. And as I initially explained, sometimes they call in to check that the community health worker actually visited homes, because they might claim that they did but didn't do that. And so moving on to the social technical challenges that affect the environment in which feedback is collected. So there are three primary social technical challenges, and I'll jump right into them. So one is community relationships. Now, think about how community health workers are selected in their community. These are people who are from some local environment. They're selected by their own people and trained. But you can imagine that the relationships with everyone is not guaranteed to be ideal. So there are cases where the village elders are not in good terms with the community health worker. And so sometimes when the supervisors go around the community to ask, the village elder might just walk up to them and provide feedback that was unsolicited. Like, oh, I just want to tell you that that community health worker working in that neighborhood is really horrible. And so the supervisor has to go back and triangulate to understand if this feedback is genuine or if it's something that maybe a jealous village elder is looking to make these people get fired. The sensitivity of the type of information that's collected also informs the way people provide feedback. So there are cases where a male community health worker might be chatting with a female beneficiary and is asking questions that helps him do his work better. So it's say, when was your last menstrual period? When was the last time you felt like you had maybe some sexual encounter with your husband and all that? And the beneficiary feels, oh my God, this is an inappropriate question, even if it's a question that's required for them to do their work properly. So you can imagine if you go back to ask this beneficiary about the experience, they would say, oh my God, this person is always prying into my information when they shouldn't. And the last part of this is the organizational policy compared to the community expectations. So the community health workers that we studied in the context of living goods were health workers who weren't paid, but were told to sell medications to beneficiaries so they could get some sort of stipend to maintain or sustain their work. But there had been organizations in the past and NGOs who had been in this same community who had provided medications to some of these beneficiaries for free. And so these beneficiaries have this mental model of all medications are free, but a health worker is coming to me and saying, oh, you need to pay 20 shillings for me to sell this medication to you. So they're thinking, are you trying to get money from me because you're supposed to be providing this to me for free? And so there's this tension between the health worker and the beneficiary, but in many cases, the health worker just gives out the medications because they feel, well, this child is dying and the parent is not on the same page with me. I can't watch them die. And so these are three core design themes that should be thought about in developing beneficiary feedback systems that collect feedback and also connect care recipients to the health feedback loop. And I'll briefly talk about some of the ways that these challenges might be tackled when designing feedback systems. So for cases where you have non-equitable feedback systems, you need to promote feedback in a way that you collect responses from people, whether they have phones or they don't. And also for people who don't want to provide feedback or are biased to provide only positive feedback because it's not anonymous, then it makes sense to provide some sort of channel where they can say what they want to say in an anonymous way without the problem of expressing their opinions, especially if it's negative feedback. And then lastly, for cases where there are chance encounters where people collect feedback, you could formalize this so you can capture that feedback at a higher level and get a sense of what the community is thinking. So these are takeaways. Care recipients have been left out of the feedback loop. Simple cases that people wouldn't really think about affect the kinds of feedback or feedback practices that are ongoing. And one of them is phone ownership, as well as collecting feedback in informal settings that might bias the feedback towards positive responses. And lastly, designers should consider the equity, privacy, and chance encounters that happen in communities when designing feedback tools. I shall take your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions?
Do you have recommendations on what may be good feedback mechanisms that may work?
Sorry?
Do you have recommendations on what may be good feedback mechanisms that may work?
Yes, definitely. So this work is phase one of a three-part process. And what we're looking at now to collect feedback is to use tools such as IVR and USSD or SMS for people who have phones, as well as formalized cases where supervisors who already go into communities with mobile apps can have some simple form in their mobile app that helps them collect feedback when they're, during chance encounters.
Hi. I was wondering. Sorry.
No worries.
I was wondering if you thought also about different ways and opportunities to send feedback back to the beneficiaries. I mean, you mentioned like Ola, Uber, whatever ratings and stuff, where people can see the rating of the driver. Besides that, maybe what were other potential opportunities for people seeing the results of their feedback?
Yep, that's a good question. We haven't thought about that yet. But I imagine that that's something that's useful, but it also comes with its own problems, especially when you start considering cases where people share phones, and this is something we saw in our context. So if someone's going to provide feedback anonymously, and you provide some channel to show them the feedback that they provided, if it's a negative feedback, then it's no longer anonymous because the device is shared. So.
Hi, I may have missed, but who was making the calls for the feedback?
What'd you say?
Who was making the calls for the feedback?
Some supervisors at the NGO who had been selected as people who had to make the calls for the feedback. Yeah. Oh.
Take the time to.
I had a question on if you noticed changes in the ways in which care recipients responded. So one of the points that you raised was care recipients respond differently given privacy challenges that they face. Yep. I wondered if you noticed demographic differences in that, and if so, if there were insights that you had on the kinds of spaces that made people feel more comfortable in sharing valuable feedback.
Yeah, it's a very good point. So you can imagine in cases where it's a chance encounter and I'm meeting a supervisor and nobody else is seeing me, maybe I feel comfortable to provide negative feedback. But if I feel that I'm in a setting where it's a marketplace and my neighbor could hear me, then I mostly just want to say positive feedback.
Thank you. So next up is Sudesh Singanamalla. He's going to be talking about Pocket ATM, understanding and improving ATM accessibility in India. Thank you. That was a good fan club.
Hello, everyone. Can you all hear me? Okay. I understand that I'm standing between you and coffee. So I promise to make this fun, and I promise to make it engaging. So hello, everyone. I'm Sudesh. I'm a research fellow at the Microsoft Research India Lab. And this work on Pocket ATM is in collaboration with some amazing colleagues, Venkatesh, Colin, and Indrani. And a huge shout out to Bill and Manohar for constantly supporting us through our work. Often in ICTD, it's difficult because we're designing for somebody else, but in this case, we have the rare opportunity and privilege to count ourselves among one of the beneficiaries. One of my brilliant colleagues and friends at MSR India, Venkatesh, happens to be visually impaired, but he's extremely independent. One of the problems he's noticed is that if you can't see, you can't really use an ATM in India. India is home to 1/3 of the world's visually impaired population. These users face significant usability and privacy challenges while using digital financial technologies, which are becoming quite widespread. In this talk, I would like to take you through a journey around the usage of ATM machines among visually impaired population. So we motivate our work by showing that despite government mandates, accessibility of ATMs is really hard to implement in India. We speculate that this is because it's too expensive, or there are not enough monetary incentives for banks to actually go ahead and do them. We then use some mixed methods and studies to understand ATM usage among the visually impaired population. And then with this as motivation, we go ahead and design a low-cost ATM accessibility system that allows visually impaired users to access ATMs without requiring any high costs in upgrading the existing banking infrastructure. So it all started with a few unsuccessful attempts by Venkatesh, who's a co-author in this paper. And this was primarily because the ATMs were not accessible. And this encouraged us to look deeper into how ATM machines are actually made accessible, how many of them exist, and what is really the state of accessible ATMs today. The Reserve Bank of India, which is the RBI, is a regulatory body which controls banking policies, regulations, and other important financial services. And the Reserve Bank of India mandates that in India, at least 1/3 of the ATM machines that exist have to be accessible to people with disabilities. For people with visual impairments, this means that the ATMs have a feature called a talking ATM, which is basically a software update which reads out all the instructions on the ATM screen to the user who plugs in a headphone jack into the ATM. So how many of you have seen a headphone slot on an ATM machine or a cash machine? Okay. During our experiences, we noticed that the circular has not been implemented correctly. And we did a few visits and we noticed that some of the ATMs had missing headphone jacks which were not labeled, or braille labels which were actually covered with thick plastic cards, rendering the braille useless. So all these machines were literally inaccessible. And these very features that we're talking about, the headphone, the braille label, are a part of the mandate that was set by the Reserve Bank of India in the circular that they had given. For example, the mandate says that an accessible ATM should speak. And guess what people did to it? The banks and the manufacturers made them say, welcome and thank you, and nothing else in the middle, right? Some other things that we noticed is that ATMs regularly run out of cash, and you see these kinds of boards put in front of the ATM telling that the ATM is out of cash. But something like this is not accessible for people with visual impairments, and it becomes much harder for them to actually understand that this ATM cannot be used. At the same time, many of these ATMs are now being upgraded to touchscreen ATMs, and they do not follow any accessibility guidelines of having multi-touch gestures on them or speaking out the actual content that's being touched on the screen. So by the time someone has actually touched the screen, they might have clicked on the wrong button. Also, there is no screen magnifier on any of the ATM machines, making it inaccessible for people with low vision who use screen magnifiers on a day-to-day basis. So let's look at the history of this, right? The policy for ATMs in India, the ATM accessibility first started in 2009, and then the circular was reissued because there was no work that was done on it until in 2011, after which in 2013, a group of banks called the Indian Banks Association got together and set out and put out a detailed list of step-by-step instructions telling this is how an accessible ATM has to be built. But what really makes an accessible ATM for visually impaired users? It needs a working headphone jack, it needs the ability to turn the screen on or off for privacy reasons, and it needs to successfully navigate the user across all the screens in the ATM, while at the same time orienting them to the physical layout of the ATM, like where the cash register is, where the card insert slot is, and so on. These are, again, a subset of the much larger list of accessibility features that you would expect, right? So, curious to understand, we started off by doing a random sample of 20 ATMs in central Bangalore. And we were looking for these accessibility conditions that I just told you about. But surprisingly, only 3 out of these 20 that we surveyed were completely accessible. And it was just bad to see that number, 3 on 20, that's like 15%, right? Sorry. Yeah, it's pretty low. Okay. So we then went ahead and took 2 ways around the problem. So one was using the Right to Information Act, and the other was crowdsourcing, right? So as Aruna Roy, our keynote speaker on the first day, mentioned, the Right to Information Act of 2005 in India gives Indian citizens the right to request for information from public authorities who should reply to you within a fixed time frame, within 30 days actually. So we filed a request for information with the Reserve Bank of India, and we asked a bunch of detailed questions. And so these questions involved things like, what are the types of ATMs that you have? What are the technical specifications of them? Who maintains these ATMs, and so on? And these were also the same questions we asked during the crowdsourcing survey that we tried running. Surprisingly, only 8 of the 21 public sector banks actually replied to us. The rest of them are still pending. But what we found really surprised us. One of the banks said, we have 100% accessibility. And this was inaccurate because we found one of their ATMs not to be accessible, or we actually found more than one of their ATMs not to be accessible. And many others were very conservative and said, we have 27% accessibility, which is less than the 33% that we're really looking for. And one bank said, oh, I'm sorry, we don't have any accessible ATMs yet, and we plan to deploy them starting next year. And this is the status a decade after the ATM mandate, ATM accessibility mandate has been set out. 2 of these banks cleverly evaded our questions, which is something that we expected, and cited reasons telling that your request was actually not phrased as a request, but rather you're demanding us to give information. And another said, this is commercial confidence, so we can't really tell you about this information. So for the crowdsourcing efforts, we reached out with the same questions to a set of volunteers whom we found using social media, and we asked them, so we gave them a mobile app with the same questions, and a basic, like a small training web page, telling them how to identify the different accessibility features and how to report them to us. So the volunteers went ahead and we collected results from 107 ATMs across India. 94 of them were from Bangalore and 13 from other regions. And if you look deeper here within Bangalore and within central Bangalore, you will see 7 red dots. These are 7 accessible ATMs out of 29 in central Bangalore. But we also found that 1/3 of these ATM machines, 33% of them, did not even contain a headphone slot, and some others contained a dual headphone slot. Like, who uses those plain headphones anymore, right? And majority of these ATMs did not even have static messages, making them completely inaccessible. So with an understanding of the current state of accessibility in the city and curious to understand how visually impaired users actually used ATMs, we went ahead and interviewed 22 participants after getting their consent. And all these participants that we had were experienced screen reader users. So they knew how, they had some kind of formal training in how to use screen readers, be it TalkBack or VoiceOver or JAWS or NVDA. So what we found were common misconceptions. So some of them believed that the bank did not give them an ATM card, maybe because it could be because of their impairment or education levels. But the government mandates that every single person be given the same banking facilities irrespective of disability. At the same time, the lack of standardization of these machines, which means that the card insert slot on one machine is at a different location on different machines, makes it extremely hard for these users to actually go by themselves and use the ATM. Some others were pretty much worried about holding up the lines in front of the ATMs because they knew that using ATM as a visually impaired user takes a much longer time than for somebody else who's not visually impaired. And some of them decided to even give sensitive information such as their PIN to their friends or family to go and do the banking on their behalf. So keeping the issue of financial privacy, security, and the ease of usage in mind, we designed Pocket ATM to leverage the increasing usage of smartphones and mobile internet users in the country and analyzing the existing financial infrastructure that was there. So Pocket ATM is a mobile-first approach which shifts the accessibility from the physical ATM infrastructure to your mobile device because a mobile app can be made accessible much easier. And we believe that this approach would work primarily because hardware updates are extremely expensive and the widespread deployment of these ATMs in the country make it really hard to do something like this. So let's take a look at how the new approach changes. First, I log into the banking application using a smartphone and enter a PIN. And once I log in, I tell my smartphone that, hey, I want to withdraw 1,000 rupees. Once I pre-authorize this request, I walk to any ATM of my choice, insert my card, receive an OTP on my phone, and enter the OTP as a temporary PIN, either into the machine or on my phone itself. The reason why we want to use OTP here rather than the PIN is because of the shoulder surfing attacks that could happen where someone looking over and trying to understand your PIN. This also works as two-factor authentication in our case, and tada, the ATM gives you cash, right? So building this is quite simple, and it can be made secure with simple cryptographic procedures. And most importantly, it does not require any updates to the existing ATM infrastructure in the country. So please see our paper, which contains the implementation details. And at the same time, this builds on top of the Unified Payments Interface, or UPI, which is a layer from the National Payments Corporation of India. So considering the sensitive nature of the implementation, we did a pilot of this using a mock ATM setup, where we asked the same participants we interviewed earlier to come and start using the system. The task that we had given them was to log in into this system using their phone number, where they had predefined accounts that were set up for them, and they had to do a pre-registration, pre-authorization transaction, and then visit an ATM setup that we had and withdraw the amount from there. So throughout the process, we recorded the errors that they had made, where they needed help, and so on. And what we found was that Pocket ATM guarantees that any ATM can be made accessible. And all of our users actually withdrew money successfully in less than a minute. Previous ATM accessibility studies move up to 4 minutes for someone to actually withdraw the transaction. And the time to pre-authorize a transaction actually changes with practice, and this is something that people could do sitting at the comfort of their own home. And after the experience, we interviewed the participants who really liked the system, rated it a 9.1 on a 10-point Likert scale, but they were really concerned about the timely delivery of OTP and what happens if I enter the wrong OTP and things like that. Additionally, they gave a few more suggestions around how these apps could be enhanced for people with low vision, and maybe sending an SMS after the transaction about the denominations that exist. So Pocket ATM really is a promising option for improving the status of accessibility as it is today, and it's a low-cost alternative to upgrading all the hardware and fixes the policy loopholes that exist in the country. While the current work is focused in India, the same thing could be expanded to any other country which has similar financial infrastructure like India. The ability to perform these transactions independently opens up tremendous new opportunities for people today. And thank you, by the way, to end on a lighter note, to potential advisors in the audience. I am applying to grad school this year, and I would love to talk to you and hear feedback. Thank you, and I'm open to questions.
Fantastic plug. Any questions?
Yes.
So have you spoken to banks, and how willing are they to adopt?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you clearly.
Let me try from here. I don't know, is this any better? No?
Maybe you could move the mic.
Oh, more closer?
Yeah.
Have you spoken to any banks about deploying this, and are they open to, like, making a software? I guess this would need some kind of software update to their existing ATMs, and are they willing to do this?
Yeah, so sorry, I was running out of time, but this is one of the things that we wanted to do. So we are planning to work with the UPI and the National Payments Corporation to see if we can maybe put it up as a software update. I don't know if there's anyone from Google here or who works with the Google Pay team. They might be interested to integrate this somewhere into their Tez app.
I thought this was a fantastic talk. What problems still remain for visually impaired people when they do use your tool?
Okay, so I think the biggest problem is really reaching the ATM and finding out whether the ATM doors are open or not. There were some experiences that we've had where even the security guard who sits in front of an ATM sometimes thinks that when a visually impaired user plugs in their headphone into the ATM, they might be hacking into the system or doing something about that. And they tell them, please don't do anything to this ATM, because they're not really used to someone doing something like this. So I think a bigger problem that we face, which we've not looked at here, is essentially how do we successfully navigate a visually impaired person by themselves independently to an ATM, and then enable them to perform transactions on this.
Thank you for thank you all for staying up, and
thank you.
And so I just want to make 3 quick announcements. I'm just going to hand it out to for the poster session first, and in a second. But I want to kind of put put a plug again for the evening food and music. And this is not just some entertainment, as Neha was saying earlier. This is actually fits in with the theme of our conference. This is about Kabir songs, and it's very personal to me because I've named my son Kabir based on the music troupe that's coming today, and it's really, really fantastic. So I strongly encourage you to show up and attend and also eat the food. I also want to remind you that tomorrow, for those of you who are here, the keynote by Murali Shanmugavelan is at 8:30 in the morning. I know we've been consistently late it's partly because, as Kentaro said, we had set the precedent in the first day, so it's presumably our fault, but I request you all to show up at 8:30 for the keynote. There's really not much room later on in the day, so I would strongly kind of set the alarm or whatever you want to do to please try and make it, because Murli is here. He's come all the way from the UK for this, so I would not want you to be missing it just because we couldn't get up an hour early. With that, thank you.
All right, so next in the schedule, we have the demo and then the poster session. So as soon as you walk out, you will see the posters hanging on the stands over there. Just for some clarification, posters in this category, we included late-breaking work and preliminary research, or things that are not suitable to be presented as a full paper. So as soon as you walk out and talk to people, they're very hungry for your comments and feedback because they really want to know your opinion and hear about potential directions that they can take their research to. We had a total of 34 submissions. 17 were accepted as posters. We also invited 29 papers that were submitted as full paper to be resubmitted as posters. So 18 posters, 18 full papers were submitted as posters. I know it's late in the day. So anyways, you do the math. But anyways, I just wanted to call your attention to, go talk to people. They're really excited to present, so they didn't even wait for me to put the numbers there. So don't worry about the order on the program. Just hang around, talk to people, and give them some feedback. Thank you.